Where does all that carbon that goes into our atmosphere get trapped? The answer: forests, jungle forests, and long-living boreal forests. So we're going to be talking all about the different ways that nutrients cycle in our ecosystems. So biogeochemical cycles are necessary because there's a limited amount of matter in our ecosystem. So nothing's coming from outer space, nothing's being created on Earth except from the components that are already here. So all these chemicals must be recycled constantly. So the main biogeochemical cycles that we're going to be talking about are oxygen, carbon, nitrogen, sulfur, and phosphorus. The carbon and oxygen cycles are closely related in our ecosystem. So we've talked about these throughout school when we've talked about photosynthesis, and they can often be illustrated in the same diagram. So here we have some sources of carbon dioxide. So combustion of wood and fossil fuels, cellular respiration from plants and animals, as well as microbes and other organisms living in the soil, they all contribute to carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. The main way that we remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere is through the process of photosynthesis, which is enacted by plants, algae, and cyanobacteria. Carbon can be moved slowly or quickly through the environment. So, organisms such as grasses, animals, and microbes move carbon quickly. So, we produce it through cellular respiration and exhale it through breathing. And then it is taken in really quickly through plants in photosynthesis. Grass and, for example, agricultural crops is because they have a short lifespan of less than one season, they still count as that rapid cycling of carbon because it will be released back into the atmosphere when we either consume those grain products or when the animals consume grasses and things like that. However, some larger producers, like large trees, store carbon for long periods of time in their tissues, such as their trunks or in spruce trees, as well as their needles. And that carbon isn't recycled back into the atmosphere until the tree dies and is broken down by decomposers or is burned. So these organisms that hold carbon for a long time are known as carbon sinks. So they store carbon in the biosphere. So the oceans are the largest sources of a carbon sink in the biosphere. They store vast amounts of carbon, both just in the water and as in some of the organisms like coral that are in the water as well. The water in the ocean contains billions of tons of dissolved carbon dioxide, and the temperature of the water actually affects how much carbon dioxide can be contained in that water. Other carbon sinks include forests, especially old growth forests, rainforests, the boreal forest in North America, limestone rock, so because it's calcium carbonate, as well as petroleum deposits. And petroleum deposits, coal deposits, natural gas are actually have been carbon sinks for many thousands, millions of years. So the sulfur cycle, moving on to a new topic, is an important component because sulfur is an important component of proteins. So we also may have heard of amino acids. Many bacteria use sulfur compounds in photosynthesis. So we talked previously about chemosynthesis or certain types of cellular respiration. Bacteria also release sulfur in forms that cannot be used by other organisms. So when we look at the sulfur cycle, we have a sulfur in the atmosphere in SO4 2 negative. And this can contribute to acid precipitation as the water molecules will form on the sulfur molecule, causing acid precipitation, which can then lead to sulfur in the water. Now, this water and the sulfur can be absorbed into the sediments and be deposited. We can have sulfur in our fossil fuels, so that would be sour gas. And if you've ever seen any natural gas processing facilities, they'll often have giant mounds of yellow sulfur sitting outside of them. So we also will have a sulfur in living organics contained in the proteins of the plants. And then sulfur is released back into the soil through that process of decomposition. It will be uptaken by the roots of plants. It's used by microorganisms as well as produced by microorganisms that live in the soil. So looking back at acid deposition or acid rain. So this is caused by the combustion of fossil fuels that contain sulfur. So natural gases and petroleums that contain a little bit of sulfur into the atmosphere. So when we talk about clean natural gas, this is the natural gas that's had the sulfur removed from it. Sulfur dioxide then in the atmosphere reacts with oxygen and water vapor to form sulfuric acid and sulfurous acid. When it condenses, it falls as acid precipitation. Now, in Alberta, we typically don't have a problem with acid precipitation because our soil is a little bit basic. So if any acid precipitation does fall, it's typically neutralized. Whereas other parts of North America, such as Northern Ontario, because they do not have a basic soil, that acid rain can change the pH of lakes and rivers and surface water and the ground, where it has caused lots of problems with the loss of trees and animals and change the pH of water so that other organisms can't live there. The nitrogen cycle is another cycle that is important to the biosphere because nitrogen is required by organisms to form amino acids and to form proteins. So both sulfur and nitrogen are used to form proteins, and nitrogen is also an important part of the structure of our DNA. The nitrogen gas in our atmosphere, so nitrogen actually makes up about 70% of the atmosphere, cannot be used for this purpose. It has to be converted into other forms first before it's available for organisms to use. So the nitrogen in the atmosphere can be turned into usable nitrogen in several different ways. One of them would be denitrifying bacteria in the soil who turn it into nitrates, which can then be absorbed by plants. We also have nitrogen fixing bacteria in the roots of legumes such as peas and beans, which is an alfalfa, which is often why farmers will plant those in rotation with their other crops because it helps add nitrogen back to the soil. Decomposers will also take dead plants and dead animals and turn it into ammonia, which then, with nitrifying bacteria, will turn it into nitrates, which are then usable by the plants again. And interestingly, lightning, when it strikes the ground, also adds nitrogen into the soil. So an important term to remember is nitrogen fixation. So nitrogen fixation is the conversion of atmospheric nitrogen into ammonium or NH4+. So this is carried out by the nitrogen fixing bacteria, like I said, in the roots of legumes. So alfalfas, peas, beans, which is why they're important crops to grow. Ammonification also produces ammonium. So this is again the breakdown of organic matter done by decomposers. So during denitrification, bacteria complete the cycle by breaking down nitrogen into compounds that's released back into the atmosphere or into forms that are usable by plants. Denitrification typically occurs in anaerobic environments. So this is environments where oxygen doesn't occur. The phosphorus cycle is the one biogeochemical cycle that does not cycle through the atmosphere. Phosphorus is another important component to cellular materials, creating DNA, phospholipids of our cell membranes, as well as ATP, or that energy molecule that we use. It doesn't cycle in the atmosphere, but it is found in soil and water. Large amounts of phosphorus are stored in rocks and released during erosion. Phosphorus is also a substance that we'll use as fertilizer mixes for our lawns, for our plants, for our gardens, and for our crops. So the reason rain is in this cycle is because rain, as it falls on the ground, will cause erosion during runoff and the weathering of phosphate from rocks. Then phosphate will be carried in that water into a body of water. Through geological uplifting, so we have sedimentation, new rocks are formed, we might have a lake that dried up, or we might have mountains that are formed over millennia, and then that phosphorus is moved back out from underneath the water into a place where it can weather and erode. So phosphates in soil are taken up by plants, which is why we use phosphates in our fertilizer, and then as producers eat those plants, they get the phosphates in their body. As plants die, the phosphates are then broken down as decomposers, because I told you that they had a very important role in the ecosystem, taking those chemical components of life and putting them back into usable forms in the soil. Now, we can't have as much phosphorus as we'd like in our atmosphere and in our environment, not our atmosphere, in our environment, because the overabundance of phosphorus can cause a few problems. So, most of the phosphorus in the world is locked in rocks and sediment. So, the growth and use in plants is limited. However, when we add extra phosphorus to an environment, it can cause uncontrolled growth of algae. So we'll see this in like algal blooms. And two main causes of algal blooms will be runoff from urban environments where people have fertilized their lawn. And then as it rains, the fertilizer will soak in, some of it runs off. Then, because we have all the concrete surfaces, that water goes through storm drains and into water bodies, causing an overabundance of phosphorus in those water bodies. Another cause of overabundance of phosphorus is runoff from agricultural services as well as animal waste. So often, if you have animals and farms upstream of large water bodies, after a large rain, there's a runoff, and that phosphorus gets into the water body system and it can cause an algal bloom. Now, this can also be caused from human waste. So we'll often see algal blooms in lakes where there's a lot of cabin around them, where maybe people's septic tanks are leaking and or old outhouses don't always seal well. To help combat this issue, lots of dish detergent companies have actually removed phosphorus from the detergents in laundry as well as dish soap to help combat the overabundance of phosphorus in our water bodies. So when we look at energy and matter transfer, we have energy involved in every step of these cycles, whether it's evaporation from the water, using the sun, or animals consuming plants, or decomposers breaking down plants. As well, if you remember, water was also a necessary component of all these cycles. So we have phosphorus dissolving in the water, nitrogen dissolving in the water, carbon dioxide dissolving in the water, oxygen dissolving in the water. And moving around in the water is a very efficient way that lots of these chemicals can get from one location to the other. Okay. As always, it was great to see you today. And if you need, remember to rewatch the video. Bye.
If you enjoyed this video, check out our website online.plrd.ab.ca and visit us on Facebook, Prairieland Online Academy. You can find out all that's going on with Prairieland Online Academy.